Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Karel Beckman, and I have the honor to interview Mark Gober. And he's the author of 7 books. And his last book is called An End to Upside Down Liberty in English, but it has been translated into Dutch. Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van vrijheid. It's his second book that has been translated into Dutch. It's a kind of a unique book because it makes the connection between libertarianism on the one hand and spirituality, I can say, that on the other hand. And you even use the term spiritual libertarianism in your book at a certain point. So I think a lot of people will be interested to hear your views on this. But first, let's introduce you, because I think not many people will know you in Holland. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about yourself. How did it all start?
Well, it was an unexpected journey. I'll start by saying that. I never planned on writing books. I went to Princeton University for my undergraduate degree. And after that, I worked in investment banking in New York with UBS, which is a global investment bank with a large presence in Switzerland. But I was in New York on Park Avenue, working in 2008.
Okay.
So this was during the financial crisis.
So what was it like?
It was a crazy time to be there. Investment banking is challenging normally, but I was at one of the banks that was having problems publicly, and our clients were other banks and insurance companies and asset managers. So I was working with companies that were under distress.
And maybe we're getting ahead of things, but were you aware at that time that maybe things were not quite right? I mean,
not at all.
No.
I was just doing the next thing in front of me, very mainstream. I wasn't asking questions. I was just trying to succeed. And I left investment banking in New York to join a firm based in Silicon Valley, also with the presence in Boston. So I spent about 18 months in Boston, then the rest of my time in Silicon Valley, advising technology-focused companies on their intellectual property and their business strategy and their technology. Okay. So business world.
That's a world of difference then, between that period in your life and the books that you've written, because maybe you can tell our audience what the first book was called, I think, An End to Upside Down Thinking.
Correct.
And you won a Booker Prize for that. What was that book about?
That was about basically the nature of reality itself. What is this place? Who are we? Why are we here? And what is some of the science that we don't learn about in school that challenges the mentality that many of us have, the one that I certainly had. And I was researching some of that while I was still working in Silicon Valley at my firm, Sherpa Technology Group. And I learned about these topics, and it shifted my perspective so much that a year later, this was in 2017, I said I should write about this and summarize the science.
Okay. And that was so what is the nature of reality? Do you believe in the Big Bang Theory, for example?
Well, I think there are problems with many of these theories.
Yeah.
But most fundamentally, what is a human being? Is our body, when our body dies, is that the end of our consciousness, our sense of experiencing? Does it end then? Or is there a continuation of our consciousness when our body dies?
So that was already the topic of your first book?
Yes.
And what came after?
So right after that, I wrote An End to Upside Down Living, which is more about the implications of this worldview related to consciousness in terms of everyday living and how do we approach life. And I wrote that right around the time that COVID was starting, actually right before the lockdowns. So prior to that point, I was not a political person at all. I didn't even have political opinions because I hadn't looked into it. And then COVID happened, and politics, that became a big issue, and I didn't have opinions. And I also noticed that there were many people who might have agreed with my first 2 books in terms of the science of consciousness, but they had very different opinions on what was happening with COVID politically.
Okay. So what was your reaction to the COVID policies?
My initial reaction was I saw a lot of censorship around what seemed to be reasonable counter-arguments to the prevailing hysteria, basically, where people were saying we need to lock down, keep everyone apart, and other people were saying, even doctors, this is not as severe as we're being told on television. And I was drawn to the people who countered the narrative. I was drawn much more to the freedom-oriented opinions that I saw were being censored all over the place. And it led me to ask a lot of questions. And at the same time, in the US, we had the big election between Trump and Biden, and many people had different opinions on that. So I was becoming interested in those topics for the first time.
Okay, so did that coincide with your third book, or maybe we can go through the list to get a sense of perspective?
Yes.
Because you must have written them in an incredibly short time.
Yeah, the books happened quickly, but I was very focused, so I was learning a lot.
You told me you gave up your business career, right?
Yes, I had become a partner at my firm. I spent 10 years there, and I left to continue pursuing this. So I had only written the first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, while I was working, and then the last 6 have been since I left the firm. The third book was An End to Upside Down Liberty, even though it was most recently translated into Dutch.
Ah, okay, I didn't realize that.
2021 is when I wrote it, because I was trying to understand. My initial reaction to the political landscape was that I saw, let's say in America, that was my focus, the political left was much more in favor of the lockdowns and things like vaccine mandates, which I felt strongly that did not align with basic values of freedom.
Yeah. But did you identify with the left before that time? Were you a liberal, as they say in America? Or?
No, I didn't have any identification at all. Okay. But I knew many people who were very liberal, who I respected.
Yeah.
So I was confused, because I agreed with them on certain things, and other things I said, this is a little bit crazy. So I was trying to find my own way. And during that era of 2020, I found that the political right in the US was much more aligned with principles of freedom with regard to health and bodily autonomy with regard to vaccines and things like that, and allowing people to make their own decisions and not wanting to shut down businesses quite as much. So I was more aligned with many of those voices. But even, as you know, in my book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, it's not about the left or the right, it's about freedom more broadly, because both sides of the spectrum end up having their own ways of being tyrannical.
Right.
And that's what I discovered when I started to research and learned about figures like Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises, and learning about the true principles of freedom.
Yeah, I should recommend everybody to read Rothbard. He's great. He's not talked about a whole lot. He's not very well known in Holland. I certainly recommend him. But before we get to this book, then maybe you can tell me what the other books were about.
Yeah, sure. So the next book, An End to Upside Down Contact, that was in 2022, so a year later, and that was about basically contact with non-human intelligences, and it relates to more metaphysical topics of, are there forces?
You talk about aliens, or
I talk a bit about the UFO phenomenon, because it's so, now that's in the news everywhere. The governments are revealing that this has happened, and throughout history there have been reports.
So to make it very simplistic, do you believe in aliens and UFOs? Or?
Well, I think there are other advanced intelligences that have been in contact with human civilization.
And what makes you think that?
There are many lines of evidence throughout history that describe very similar things, and even in altered states of consciousness that are being studied in a rigorous manner, like a near-death experience. Dr. Pim van Lommel, who I mentioned in my books, Dutch cardiologist, has studied the phenomenon where someone is clinically dead, cardiac arrest, their consciousness expands.
Well, near-death experience, right?
The near-death experience.
Yeah. So an end to the upside down of contact. What do you mean by contact? Contact with
with non-human intelligence.
Okay.
So in a near-death experience, people will contact. They'll say, we had a being of light that communicated with me when their brain was off. And even psychedelic accounts, this has been reported. So there are many independent areas where there are people reporting similar things.
And why did you write that book? Is it to convince people that there are other intelligences?
I wrote it because it, at least for me, it expanded my way of thinking about reality and even history, and also the political landscape, because it makes me question the extent to which our power structures are being influenced by these forces that we don't always recognize, because sometimes it could be in our mind we're being influenced, or sometimes it's maybe more in a physical sense where we're being nudged or people are being blackmailed or things like that.
Really? And it reminds me a bit of David Icke. You know David Icke?
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, what do you think of him?
He has so many different opinions on things, so it's hard to categorize generally, but I respect the questioning of the way in which power structures are being influenced?
Mm.
I think it's an important question to answer. And that's what I had been looking at in the Liberty book. I mention it a little bit when I get into metaphysics and into upside down liberty. But I'm curious because the structures seem to be so tyrannical. We saw the entire world being shut down. And it's made me ask questions. Is there more than meets the eye as to why this is happening?
Yeah.
So I explored contact.
Okay. And then do you have any answers to this question? I mean, if you say that there may be power structures behind what we are seeing,
Mhm.
what is your conclusion? I mean,
I think there are.
Hmm.
I think there are dark and light forces, let's say, that have been talked about in every tradition, every spiritual, mystical, religious tradition throughout history. They talk about the good versus evil in different ways. And I think there's something to that. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's evidence.
Do you identify with any particular religion, or are you a religious person?
No. I would say there are aspects of all religions that I resonate with, but I don't have one.
Okay. So what followed the contact book?
Next was called An End to the Upside Down Reset, which is about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset agenda,
Okay.
which to me is not a conspiracy theory because it was literally a book written by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malloret in 2020 called COVID-19, The Great Reset. And it lays out a vision for society. So in that book, I lay out what I consider to be, as I read their book, the different categories in which they want to steer society. So it's culturally, politically, economically, environmentally, with the climate crisis that they're so concerned about, technologically, and also metaphysically. So I break down those areas and show, even though they describe the plan as a compassionate one, it's actually very detrimental to society as I see it. It's anti-freedom.
Okay. Well, we have to ask Fred to give us more translations, because I think that is a topic that also interests a lot of people. I didn't know you had written about that. So, but let's finish the list.
Okay.
And,
So the next one is An End to Upside Down Medicine. That was in 2023. And it relates to liberty as well, because we saw with COVID that medicine was used to weaponize government and to be able to tyrannize. So what I look at in the book is not only the way in which actually our consciousness affects health, but also the way in which the allopathic model of health is deeply flawed. Even to the level of the germ theory of disease, there are many assumptions that we've made about viruses and bacteria, which, upon being examined, are very problematic.
But do viruses exist?
Do viruses exist? So I go into that in the book. And
what's your answer?
I would say, using the scientific method, which is what is needed to determine something scientifically, meaning you have an independent variable and proper controls. Very simple. The field of virology does not obey that. And that has been, since 1954, the fundamental study where they've claimed to isolate a virus. They actually don't isolate it using the traditional definition of the term. Why is that important? Because you would, in a study, to show that a virus causes disease, you would want to have just a virus and then show that that is the thing causing the effects in the study. They don't do that.
But if I get a cold, and my wife gets a cold 3 days later, and then my mother,
Yes.
and how do you explain that?
Yes, so this is it's a logical fallacy. It's called affirming the consequent, where if you look outside and you see the grass is wet, you say, Mark, it rained.
It's like,
well, maybe the sprinkler system was on.
But then you have to have an alternative explanation.
So that's the question. Do you have to have an alternative? I would say that you can falsify one paradigm without knowing exactly what the right answer is. But there are many theories. So some people would say, your whole family got sick with similar symptoms. You were in the same place. What were the toxins that you were exposed to? Did you eat something similar? Were there electromagnetic effects? Think about yawning. One person yawns, another person yawns. It's not contagious in a germ sense, but there was something. Or think about women who have a synchronization of menstrual patterns when they live in the same place. There's nothing physical being transmitted. What if there was a similar emotional trauma? So there are many things we could get into. We could get into biofields and resonance, maybe aspects of science that are not typically acknowledged.
Yeah. How do you sort of obtain all this knowledge and then in such a short time?
A lot of research. I immerse myself. Yeah, I just want to know.
Yeah. Okay. Are you still active in investment banking, or not at all anymore?
No, not anymore.
No.
Not anymore. But I was at the time, very passionate about what I used to do.
Okay. Well, let's talk about your what for us is your latest book, but it's not. I guess I understand now, but it's the latest that's been translated into Dutch, and it's about libertarianism and spirituality, as we said, spiritual libertarianism. You call it. Maybe I mean let's first talk about what libertarianism is in because it's a term I think it's become more popular in recent years, more better known in Holland as well. People talk about it, but still, there's there are differences of opinion about it or what it means exactly. What is your view?
Yeah. Well,
Because what I was going to say is that uh, most people associate it with classical liberalism. The liberalism used to be, we're for freedom, and now it's become, it means something totally different in a way.
Yeah.
So when people say classical liberalism, they talk about the old ideas, the limited government.
Yeah.
That's basically the most important thing. Is that what libertarianism is to you? Or?
Well, to me, there's a spectrum. People use the term differently. I think about it in the pure sense of no government at all, meaning all the functions that the government currently performs, which are very important functions, could be provided by a free market, by private companies. That would be, to me, the purest sense of libertarianism. But it is also used to describe having a traditional government, but just much more limited than we currently have it, where the government is much smaller and doesn't do as much. But to me, it's about abiding by the non-aggression principle, which is a very simple idea. Don't initiate aggression against anyone or their property. And if someone does it to you, you have a right to self-defense. And government, to me, under the current paradigm known as statism, violates the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, so that's okay. In your book, you clearly write about a state where we could get where we have no state, right?
Yeah.
Which is not maybe exactly the same as no government. You can have a government without a state. I assume.
I guess it depends on how we define the terms.
Okay. Because people, I mean, human societies, we need rules, right, to solve conflicts. How do you go about that?
Right.
Without a
So let's
state?
just say without a state. Let's define the state, perhaps, like as Murray Rothbard and others have, which is that it is an organization that obtains its revenue, so it gets money, not by voluntary exchanges, but rather by coercion or force, and has a monopoly on the use of violence over a certain territory. So it's all of the things that government does could be obtained through some kind of a voluntary service. And that's maybe what you're talking about, where there could be a government that provides all the services that the current state does, where you are a voluntary subscriber. You can say, I like this service, I'm going to pay for it in the way that they offer it, and we're going to have a contract between us that specifies all those things. Whereas right now we have a social contract, and we have much more implied consent.
I would say that the social contract doesn't exist at all.
Doesn't
right?
exist. I would love to see it if it exists.
Yeah. Still, I mean, to talk about then sort of contracts with you need a contract then with police, with the courts, the law. I think for most people, it's kind of hard to imagine what that would look like.
Yeah.
So right now, the whole world, right, is divided into sort of nation states, right? So the state is all over the place. So how realistic is it to think about a world where this doesn't exist anymore?
It's a very important point. The way I look at it is it's valuable to have like a North Star, something to look at as an ideal and that we can move towards, because currently our paradigm is so far away from not having a state, like you say. But if, let's say, no state is the ideal, that maybe we would get to in the future, we don't know. If we move in that direction, we would be moving toward a smaller state, more decentralization, less centralization. So that would be the direction to move toward. And thinking about the non-aggression principle as we examine policies can be an important lens to say, look, this is a policy that they're telling us is compassionate, but it's actually initiating a lot of aggression. we should oppose this policy.
So, because I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit because I'm into libertarianism
Yeah.
myself. I've written a book about this, but I think it's important to ask those questions because a lot of people will say, well, especially people of a leftist persuasion, they will say, well, the way the state is being used right now is wrong. It should be used in the right way and to take care of people and so on. So what is wrong with that? Isn't it possible for a state to be a good force?
It's always possible that human beings could act in a benevolent way, in the same way that
Mhm.
human beings could give to charity if they wanted to. So to me, there's a logical flaw in the way that we think about government. And we look back at some of the big philosophers like Thomas Hobbes. He said that we need to have this Leviathan state because human nature is ultimately an ugly one,
Mhm.
where people are not trustworthy. And because we can't
Mhm.
trust people, we're going to take some people, a subset of the people that we don't
Yeah,
trust,
right.
and put them in power.
Yeah. They're still people.
But they're still people.
Yeah.
So this is the
It's a
problem.
contradiction.
It's a
Yeah.
contradiction.
Yeah.
And then how could we assume that those people, how can we trust them to elect the right person into power if we don't trust them? And how can we trust them to run fair elections if we don't trust them? So then we run into a problem inherently with the way we do the state because it's logically contradictory.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean an alternative would be magically the best thing ever. But my argument, and many others would say this, libertarians, is that it's relatively better. It's less bad.
Mhm. But if you look at the world today, I mean, the big problems that we face, right? It's talking about war or maybe mass immigration, which people find, how do you say it, scary.
Yeah.
You know, we've had the whole COVID thing. How does libertarianism sort of address these problems?
They're so
Mm,
tricky that there are differences among libertarians in terms of how to handle
mhm.
geopolitics.
But in your view,
Yeah,
yeah,
in my
yeah.
view, it all goes back to the non-aggression principle and defining what property is. And once the property rights have been established, not infringing upon those property rights. To me, it's that simple.
Where do property rights enter into it?
This also becomes a deeply philosophical question. The way, let's say, Murray Rothbard talked about it, which I resonate a lot with, is that first of all, our body is property, and that's not too difficult for most people to get behind. But then beyond that, how do we create the property lines? And it's ultimately a taking of natural resources and then mixing one's labor with
Mm.
it, which Rothbard and others would say it's an extension of your person once you have worked with the natural resources. Then
Yeah.
when you voluntarily trade that through non-fraudulent means,
Mhm.
it's your legitimate property. And that could be land, it could be money, it could be an art piece
Yeah,
of artwork.
yeah. Yeah, it's okay. So it starts then with we're all sort of owners of ourselves,
Yes.
right? It's in Dutch you have a word, actually a term for that. It's called zelfbeschikkingsrecht. It's the right to dispose of yourself, basically. You know, and so I think that's the basic principle of libertarianism, right?
Yeah.
But okay, but then when you talk about mixing your labor with land or things like that, you also enter into relationships with other people.
Yes.
Um, so there are then limits to the exercise of your self ownership. How do you solve that in society without a state?
Mhm. Yeah.
Let me. Do you need sort of because we get into to the spiritual
Yeah,
thing?
yeah.
Do we need a different consciousness for that?
Yeah. I think ultimately for it to work well, we do
Mm,
need a new consciousness. So I think if the state disappeared today, I don't think our problems would go away. I think we would still have problems, and I think we have big problems under the state. So ultimately, humanity will have to shift in some way to do well in whatever structure that we have. So I think that what I refer to as a consciousness shift will be needed, basically in the way that we approach life collectively, which
mhm.
starts at the individual, in my opinion. But when lots of individuals have those views, there will be a different mentality overall in which behavior would theoretically be much better. Now, the way that I talk about it in the book, in N2 Upside Down Liberty, is abiding by natural law. which gets into the spiritual dimension. What does natural law mean? And I refer in the book to the near-death experience as a very important scientific lens into this, where many doctors like Pim van Lommel, a famous Dutch cardiologist, he published in the Lancet Medical Journal, Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, they study people who come back from these near-death experiences, where sometimes they actually can perceive something with their mind when they're clinically dead that's validated as accurate. So let's say someone is on an operating table and the person's resuscitated. They'll say, I saw everything that happened in the room, I saw the operation, and I saw it from a vantage point outside my body from above. And the doctor says, well, that's impossible because we know what your body was doing. You should have been dead. The point is that some of these experiences are not hallucinations. That's very significant because many would say, well, that was just a hallucination. It's not a hallucination if it's accurate sometimes. And that's an important bridge because what they report in these experiences often is that they have a life review where they become all the people that they affected in their life. So if they harm someone, they got to be that person in the life review and experience what it was like to feel the harm through that person's eyes. And they also feel the good things. The point here is that people come back saying that there is a golden rule. Treat other people well because we're interconnected in some way, or treat people the way you want to be treated, which, by the way, every tradition around the world has mentioned that. And what Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia says, evaluating many of these people who come back, that there's something here that's even beyond morality, that the golden rule is like a natural law. So if we apply that golden rule to structuring society with government, that would point people in a very different direction than where we are now.
So, but we need that change in consciousness before we can get to sort of the an ideal or a better society.
Yeah, well, they could maybe coincide. I don't know the sequencing, but I think that's a very important prerequisite because then people would have an incentive to act well from a higher perspective, something beyond the physical that would make them not want to violate the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, but could you, I mean, based on your views on these near-death experiences and the golden rule, couldn't you imagine kind of a socialist society based on that?
Well, that still takes away from, it still enables aggression against individual property.
How? I mean,
because let's say you're forced to give your money to something that you didn't want to give towards.
Yeah, but maybe some people say, well, maybe property shouldn't exist anymore.
Right. Yeah. The problem with that is then is it okay for someone to just walk in your home and sleep on your bed and go in your refrigerator and take your food?
But they won't do that anymore because they have this higher consciousness, and they follow the golden rule.
Right. Yeah. Well, in which case, they would abide by property rights. So you could say, this is my property, and then people would respect it. My argument is that the state is still problematic in a society in which people abide by the golden rule, and this gets metaphysical. I think there are dark and light forces, and we see this even with people who are advanced religious or spiritual figures who end up committing corrupt acts. They were supposed to be so enlightened, but they get tempted. So I think it's important to have property rights in place and have that structure and not have the state, because the state is an inherently tyrannical organization that could pull people away from this higher consciousness.
Yeah. But you can have a kind of voluntary socialism then, but then it means something different.
That's very different. If it's voluntary socialism, then you are agreeing to that. It's voluntary charity.
Right.
We could call it socialism. To me, if it's same with democracy, we don't have a voluntary democracy around the world. We have a compulsory democracy, which is a form of tyranny, where some people get to say, this is our will, we impose it on the minority.
Yeah, yeah. So if you look then at, to make it a bit practical, if you look at intermediate steps, and we were talking a little bit about the American political situation now. A lot of people get into this every 4 years and they hope for change, because all these presidential candidates promise change. What do you expect of this process?
With my new lens, I see everything as tyrannical in some way. So it's hard for me to get really strongly behind either side. But what I try to do is to take a practical lens sometimes and say, which is less tyrannical, given that the state isn't going away anytime soon. So really looking at what people's policies were around COVID. That's a good benchmark for me.
Mhm.
Were they pro forced vaccinations? Were they in favor of locking people down and declaring certain workers essential or not, or businesses essential or not? Were they in favor of that? Or did they say allow people to make their own decisions?
Mhm.
To me, that's the starting point. Or let's say taxation, because to me, taxation is a form of coercive theft, of you earned money in business and someone says, I'm going to take some of that and then give
Mhm.
it to wherever. I think that's a form of theft from a libertarian perspective. So who is doing less of that, for example?
Mhm.
So that would be at least the approach. And
Yeah.
in America, to me, I see on the left much more of the tyrannical ideas from this libertarian perspective,
Mhm.
more so than on the right, at least today.
Yeah. But some people would argue that looking at the world today, the state is merely an instrument of the capitalist forces behind it,
Mhm.
right? And so they would probably blame what's going on today more on capitalism. Now, some people call it world socialism. Others call it, like,
Yeah.
we have a capitalist totalitarian system. And you can't deny that big companies are actually, have done a lot of bad things, and at least they're working together with the state to impose these restrictions on us, right?
Mhm. Well, the problem is the term capitalism
Mm.
is a misnomer. It's a euphemism, basically, for not a free market. I mean, if we're talking in the purest sense, capitalism would be a free market in which buyers and sellers can do things without a third party imposing, without being asked to do that. And we don't have that anywhere because there's always the state in the background. So we don't have capitalism anywhere. We
Okay.
have, like PJ O'Rourke said, when buying
Mm.
and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators. That's
Mhm.
what we have.
So, well, but maybe can you give an example of that then? Because um, isn't it reasonable to assume that if you have a free market, that you get very powerful companies that
Mhm,
can dictate, um, the way we have to live?
mhm. I guess what's the alternative? Right now, we have a political monopoly
Hmm.
that's supposedly regulating all the other monopolies. So we end up with a problem somewhere. The question is what's going to be worse? Where you have these big, powerful companies who can then weaponize a sanctioned monopoly to then make the rules, or not having that. So it doesn't mean that it would be a perfect system in a truly free market without government. But I would argue that it's always incrementally worse because it's sanctioned. We say this is okay that these people can make the rules. What's going to happen then? Then those people will, there's an incentive from the business world, just financially, to then influence those rules.
Hmm. Okay, but if you don't have the government, you don't have these rules, they will still they could still become very powerful.
They could become very
Mm.
powerful, but they would become powerful strictly by providing goods and services in a way in which the consumers demand those things more than from other service providers. Whereas right now, we can have all sorts of biases based on what the government is steering the economy towards.
Mhm.
We saw this with the vaccines, basically publicly funded products with limited, in some cases, no liability. That's a
Right.
great business product.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what's next? I mean, I was almost going to say, what's your next book?
Oh, well, there's one that just came out on cosmology a few days ago.
A cosmology.
Cosmology, so I'm in the mode of taking a break. I don't know what's next exactly.
But you wrote that
Yes.
also on
Yeah.
cosmology,
Yeah.
and it's already been published
Yes.
also. Okay. Well, that's so. Can you tell us about it? What?
Sure. Yeah. It's called An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, and the subtitle
Is
is
it the flat Earth or?
well, I look into what people are saying with all those things. So
Yeah.
just, I don't make any conclusions with it, but
Mm.
I show all the arguments and look at what Einstein said and um, all sorts of theories that we haven't questioned typically.
But can you give some examples?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, the
Mm.
subtitle of the book is Rethinking the Big Bang, Heliocentrism, the Lights in the Sky, and Where We Live.
Mhm.
So, for example, many of the great astrophysicists and physicists, Einstein, Stephen Hawking, they have said that there is an equivalence, basically, between saying that the Earth is at the center and things revolve around Earth versus the current model, known as heliocentrism. The
Mhm.
sun's at the center, Earth revolves around the sun. The problem from a scientific perspective is that the observations that we see in the sky could be explained by either model.
Mm.
So there's a lot of
Okay, this is a new one for me.
Yes.
So you're actually challenging the heliocentric.
There's reason to challenge it. Yes.
Oh, really? I would like to hear a little bit more about that because can you go into that a little bit more then? Because,
Yes. Okay.
Are you saying that Einstein challenged Copernicus or
Yes. So the Copernican revolution.
Yeah.
Which is the heliocentric, and Galileo, for example, that moved us away from geocentric. Geocentric is Earth is at the center,
Right.
and some would say Earth is stationary and at the center, meaning we're not moving. But many current observations in astrophysics are questioning the heliocentric view. So the cosmic microwave background, for example, this is the background radiation from the Big Bang. That's been observed for decades now, and many prizes have been awarded to it. The problem is that from the conventional heliocentric model of a Big Bang, there is supposed to be a homogeneous cosmic microwave background without a preferred direction. So isotropic is the term. It's supposed to be homogeneous and isotropic. The problem is they're finding these anomalies that are not homogeneous, and they actually have a preferred direction pointing towards Earth in some ways. And the scientists, because they're heliocentrists, they call it the axis of evil.
Okay. Axis of evil.
Axis of evil. They took this political term. So there are these anomalies in physics that actually point us away from, and there's been a philosophical debate about this. So Edwin Hubble, who came up with the expanding universe and famous scientist, he talked about basically the horror, or it was intolerable to think that Earth would be at the center, because philosophically that was a problem. Stephen Hawking said, on principles of modesty, we like to think that we're not at the center. But like I said, even Stephen Hawking admitted the observations could be explained by either the helio or the geocentric.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's turning things upside down, really. So we're now back to the Earth as the center of the universe, and a flat Earth also.
Well, if we want to go there, I do talk about that in the book. I talk about, I don't think we can know the answer to these things, because in order to know, we would have to be able to dig all the way down, and the center of Earth under the current model is about 4,000 miles. We've only dug down under 8 miles.
What about photographs from space?
Well, there are problems, because if you look on the NASA's website, they'll say this is a composite image. You know, the best thing...
But NASA is not the only one who photographs the Earth, is it?
No, but then there are problems with these images. The best one we could get, to put all the debates to rest, a camera in space that shows Earth revolving 360 degrees, full revolution, and to see the buildings pointing upwards on the top, upside down on the bottom, sideways, that we could see all of that with continuous footage. But the problem is we have these images where they're snapshots of just part of Earth. And so that's where a lot of debate comes in.
But I guess, I mean, the Russians and the Chinese and so on are also up in space and photographing. Don't they see the Earth as a globe? Or?
There are issues. So the lens, there's called a fisheye lens, and you can look on anyone's website, which creates artificial curvature. Okay. So there are complications with the data is not as objective. So ideally, we would have lots of independent parties doing these things from far away, showing the Earth in the solar system with the sun and all the planets. We have no photograph of that. So there are big questions that would, for anyone who wants definitive proof, it's not there. So there are inferences we have to make ultimately.
Okay. So we drifted away from libertarianism. Still, maybe to get the connection between the libertarianism and the spiritual part, because in the book you describe sort of two worldviews, like the materialistic or physicalistic, and what we call the alternative, spiritual.
Spiritual or non-dual is a term that people use, meaning that there's all oneness.
Yeah, non-dual, we call voluntarism, right? It's a different word for the sort of the pure libertarianism that advocates no state at all. Right?
Yes.
So how do the two connect? I mean, what is the difference between this materialistic and the spiritual worldview?
Well, the way I describe it is that it's a metaphysical political philosophy rather than just a political philosophy. So political philosophy might be statist versus a libertarian or a voluntarist. What I try to do in the book is create another axis to say, well, what is the mentality of the people within the society and within that governmental structure? And that's where it would be either a physicalist or a non-dual or some kind of spiritual. And the physicalist is what I used to be, which is we are just physical meat suits, and when we die, that's the end. There was a big bang that led us here, and it's all random. It's been billions of years. We're a random emergence, and there's no meaning built into the fabric of reality itself. Versus a more spiritual perspective, which is the human being is some kind of a vessel or something beyond us that we don't see with our eyes, and that there's real meaning built into the fabric of reality. And that would then govern people's consciousness and their behavior within a political structure. So the argument I make is that in this ideal world, if we ever get there, we want to move toward the non-dual spiritual libertarian perspective, where we have people abiding by the non-aggression principle and having this perspective of the broader significance, versus the current paradigm, which is much more of the physicalist view. That's what I learned implicitly at Princeton and as in my career, that life, if you believe in the spiritual stuff, that's superstition. We've gotten past that. And statism, more state, more physicalism. And I think we need to move in the opposite direction.
Do you think if people sort of have this materialistic view, they will sort of automatically be led to a world with less freedom, dictatorship?
Not necessarily, but I think it lends itself to that. It lends itself to less compassion, because you can end up in a survival of the fittest mentality where, oh, we're all going to die anyway. Let's just take resources and we can be tyrannical. It doesn't really matter. But if you think there's a spiritual perspective, like a life review or something, well, wait a second. Why would I want to do that harm? Because maybe I'm going to selfishly feel those consequences. I don't want to do that.
And what about the times that we are living in? For some people, these are really the crucial times, and but I'm never very sure about that, because I can imagine that people are saying this in the 19th century, in the 18th century. Is there something special about our time in your view?
I mean, throughout history, people have always thought there was something special going on. I do think what's different about our time is we just had the entire world shut down on the basis of political decisions, which to me were on the basis of faulty scientific decisions. So there's a whole chain of events of understanding medicine properly as it pertains to liberty. And so I do think that there are unique times now, also in the sense we have technology that can surveil people in new ways and can keep us
and destroy.
And destroy.
Nuclear weapons.
We have new weaponry that we didn't have before. We also have censorship in new ways. Artificial intelligence, we don't know where that's going to go. So the umbrella structure of society is critical. And then to me also, the way in which we view that society and view ourselves and view the cosmos, all of this relates to our consciousness and the way in which we operate in the world, and the way in which we either succumb to tyranny or say that this is not acceptable.
So are you optimistic, pessimistic?
I would say post-COVID, I'm actually optimistic, because so many people woke up from that, myself included. I was not a political person. I wasn't looking at these topics, and I've had a lot of learnings on my own, and I'm not the only one. So I do think there's a lot of potential. But there are many people, and I've seen this in my own life, and I'm sure many members of your audience have seen this, of people who will continue to listen to the mainstream perspective because these are what the scientists say, and that must be the answer. This is what's in the media, and that must be the answer. And there's still a lot of that. So it feels like there's a bifurcation in society where some people will go with the authority structures, and perhaps some kind of a new world, a new consciousness is emerging in parallel. So I am pessimistic still about those who are following the system and giving that energy, but I'm optimistic that there is this new world that seems to be, we're at the infancy of it, I think.
Right. And what about the supernatural intelligences that are influencing us? Can they do anything to help us?
I do talk about it in the Contact book. I don't know. I do worry, though. Some people say, well, look, there are some multidimensional beings, angels or aliens, and they're going to come save us. I get worried believing that someone is going to save us independent of our own work, because that can lead to complacency or passivity. And maybe there are saviors in some way, but I think it has to be, we have to start with ourselves.
But yeah, in your book you write about if we sort of all meditate, and that will influence the world, and maybe you even call it a new technology to achieve peace. That sounds to me a little bit, let's say, over-optimistic, but maybe, I don't know.
I think it could be one mechanism. If there's a book called An Antidote to Violence that chronicles about 20 peer-reviewed studies that show the effect of meditation on society, or at least show a correlation, where it seems that when large groups of people were meditating, there were more peaceful outcomes in certain places. I think the more general principle is when lots of people shift their consciousness, whether they're doing it in meditation or in other ways, then we could see shifts in the physical world.
But that makes sense anyway,
Yeah.
right? If people think differently, then we'll get a different world.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Is there anything that we haven't touched upon that you think that you still want to mention?
I just want to
Yeah.
emphasize that I feel it starts with the individual, and it can be distracting to look at the world around us and get upset about it. But there are things we can't always control externally. What we can control is our internal state. And that might have a bigger influence than we realize. And that does get metaphysical and some of the science of what's known as mind-matter interaction, where scientists have run studies where people's mindset actually can affect a physical system on a tiny level, on a statistically significant level. But there could be things happening when you shift your consciousness that we don't see the effects in a linear manner. We don't. It's like if you look at billiard balls, one hits the next, hits the next. That's a very linear progression. But maybe reality doesn't work in that way, where your mindset shift does other things.
All right. Well, okay. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure a lot of people will read the book or some of the other books as well. And we'll ask the publisher, Fred, to translate some more. Well, thanks a lot for this conversation, and good luck with your work.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.